The office window was a blurry mess from the rain. My eyes burned, the endless rows of numbers on the computer screens starting to swim. Couldn't face another balance sheet. I grabbed my usual, iced coffee, the bitter chill a welcome jolt, and headed out into the downpour. I needed something, anything, to snap me out of this workday daze. And there it was, a flash of vibrant green through the rain-streaked glass of the bookstore. Not a scarf or umbrella, but hair. Hair dyed the most impossible, electric shade of emerald. It tugged at something inside me, a curiosity that replaced the dull ache of my headache. The next few weeks became a game of chance encounters. Green hair at my favorite coffee place, then in line at the movie theater. Once, I even swore I spotted her a block from my apartment building. Each time, it was like the universe was poking me, saying, "Notice her, you idiot." And I did. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl with the emerald hair. Finally, the day came when I couldn't ignore it anymore. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my jittery nerves, and marched right up to her outside that same bookstore. "Excuse me," I managed to say, my voice rough. "I keep seeing you around. Would you maybe want to grab a coffee sometime?" A smile lit up her face. It was like a switch flipped, chasing away the rain clouds in my head. "I'd love to," she replied, a hint of mischief in her voice. Turns out, her name was Ava, and her laugh was like some kind of magic. We spent hours talking, books, old sci-fi movies, bands no one had heard of in a decade. For the first time in ages, I felt truly alive. Even then, a tiny, annoying voice in the back of my head kept nagging. "Aren't you forgetting something, someone?" But with Ava right there, so full of light and unexpected joy, I pushed that voice down deep. I didn't want to think about anything except her smile, and the way her eyes seemed to sparkle just a little bit brighter than her hair. That first date with Ava was like stepping into a dream. Everything was brighter, louder, more alive. All the things that had been weighing me down, the job, the apartment, my crumbling marriage with Sarah, just faded away. It was like all that mattered was making this girl with the amazing green hair laugh. And damn, did she laugh? At my dumb jokes, at my stories about growing up, at just about anything. We stayed out way too late, a whirlwind of coffee shops and dive bars. And then, as I walked her back, it happened. A quick, impulsive kiss. A spark ignited, something reckless and dangerous, and for the first time in ages, I felt a tingle of excitement. "We should do this again," she whispered, grinning. I promised we would, my heart racing, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The rest of that night was a blur. Back home, I tried to pretend like nothing had changed. Sarah was there, on the couch, going on about whatever problem had plagued her that day. A leaky faucet? A bad hair day? It all sounded like white noise. The image of Ava's smile, her voice echoing in my head, made Sarah's complaints feel suffocating. I found myself muttering something about a late night at the office and headed to the bedroom. The computer screen flickered, meaningless websites flashing by while the intoxicating feeling of that stolen kiss with Ava replayed in my head. That's all I wanted to think about. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments with Ava. Late night walks with coffee after I lied to Sarah about sudden, urgent work projects. I started to notice the way the curve of Ava's neck caught the moonlight, the way she tilted her head when she was curious, little details that burrowed into my heart. Sarah, meanwhile, kept going about her routine, seemingly oblivious to my growing distance. Of course, a small, guilt-ridden part of me wanted her to notice. It would be easier if she made a scene, yelled, threw things. But she didn't. Instead, I saw only the faded spark in her eyes, the way our life together had become a series of mumbled apologies and empty conversations. And it made letting myself fall for Ava a hell of a lot easier. The night Ava finally asked the question, it landed in the pit of my stomach like a rock. There we were, in her tiny apartment, takeout containers littering the floor, and she turned to me, her green eyes searching. "I can't keep doing this, not like this. Are you married? Like, really married?" For a moment, there was just silence. The ticking of that dumb cartoon clock she kept on her bookshelf seemed to get louder and louder, each tick a reminder of how colossally I was screwing this up. Suddenly, I felt like I couldn't breathe. This thing with Ava, it was a whirlwind, a distraction from my stale, unhappy marriage. But she was asking me to step off the ride and face the wreckage I'd left behind. Yeah, I finally said. The word came out weak, pathetic, but it's not good, Sarah and I. We haven't been happy in a long time. I'm gonna leave her, I blurted, hoping the promise sounded convincing enough, even to my own ears. Ava stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. I can't wait around until you decide. Figure it out, and then give me a call. She got up and disappeared into her room, leaving me with that god-awful cartoon clock and a whole lot of regret. The next few weeks felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. My life had become a series of awkward encounters with Sarah, punctuated by secret phone calls with Ava where I repeated my promise to leave. A promise I wasn't even sure I meant anymore. Confronting the actual act of telling Sarah I wanted a divorce, the look of devastation on her face, it felt impossible. Every day, Sarah and I tore each other apart a little more. We fought over who was getting the stupid couch, who would take the dog on weekends, who had spent more money on useless kitchen gadgets. The arguments were petty, but behind them was a chasm of unspoken pain. There were nights when I heard her crying quietly in the bathroom, and instead of offering comfort, I just lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying scenes of me and Ava. I couldn't even bring myself to look Sarah in the eye most of the time. I was a coward, and I knew it. The day I finally moved out felt like I was packing up a lifetime's worth of guilt. Sarah didn't try to fight anymore. She just moved through the room silently, her eyes hollow. The worst part was she clung to my leg as I hugged her, sobbing the whole time. "Are you coming back, Daddy?" she'd ask, and I mumbled some dumb promise about seeing her soon. Even as I said it, a sickening certainty settled in me. That promise was one I wasn't sure I could keep. My new apartment with Ava was supposed to feel like a fresh start, but even on the first night, with takeout and a bad rom-com playing on the TV, I knew something was already off. It wasn't the cheap furniture or the stacks of unopened boxes. It was the way my laughter felt a little forced. The glances Ava kept shooting my way like she was waiting for something to change. And then the real blow came. Weeks later, Lily's birthday. There I was, scrolling through photos Sarah had posted. Cake, balloons, the forced smiles that cut me right to the core. It was hard enough to see Lily looking so happy without me. But what really twisted the knife was the message Sarah had written, thanking her friends and family for their support through a difficult time. The implications of those words hit me like a ton of bricks. A few more weeks went by. The phone calls with Lily grew shorter and more awkward, her cheerful chatter replaced with quiet replies and quick goodbyes. That spark in her eyes I always adored had started to dim. The guilt was relentless. A knot in my stomach I couldn't untangle. I tell myself it was the stress of the new place, the financial worries, but I knew I was just making excuses. Then, one night, the sinking feeling turned into full-on dread. Mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, I saw it. A photo of Ava at a gym, surrounded by guys with bulging biceps. She was laughing, her head thrown back, and a wave of sickness washed over me. I couldn't stop staring. The picture ate away at me, a thousand questions swirling in my mind. Suddenly, the thrill of being with Ava was gone, replaced by the cold fear that I was just another notch on her belt. The second I saw that photo, I knew I wasn't going to let Ava get away with some vague denial. Marching over to her apartment, the image was seared into my brain. Her laughter, the way she touched that guy's arm, it made me sick. I slammed the photo down on the coffee table. What the hell is this? Ava looked up, startled. Then her eyes locked on the picture. For a moment she said nothing. Then the excuses started pouring out. Just one stupid mistake. The guy meant nothing. She was lonely while I was still tangled up with Sarah. Blah blah blah. It was a sorry excuse, and we both knew it. Tears ran down her face as she begged for forgiveness. But her words felt hollow. My stomach churned with a familiar knot of betrayal. I wasn't just angry, I was devastated. Sarah finding solace in someone else had been heartbreaking. Ava doing the same felt like a cruel echo, a cosmic joke that I was apparently the punchline of. All my righteous anger at Sarah swirled inside me, replaced with disgust at myself. Hadn't I promised myself that I'd never be that guy? The hypocrite who cheats and expects forgiveness? Here I was, in exactly that position, and to make things worse, somehow, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I was in so deep now. Sarah, Lily, my old life, they felt like distant memories. I had built this new life with Ava, and it was crumbling even before it fully took shape. Pathetic as it felt, I didn't know what else to do. So, I stayed. I told myself that I could make it work with Ava, that she'd never cheat again, that this was just a bump in the road. But even as I said those words, I didn't believe them. After that day, every time Ava was late coming home or didn't answer her phone, a wave of suspicion would drown me. The foundation of trust was gone, and all that remained was a terrible, echoing silence. Every day felt like drowning a little more. I became obsessed with Ava's every move, every text, every phone call. Those quiet conversations she'd have, turning her back to me? Were they with another guy? The late nights when she claimed to be at some girl's night? My imagination started working overtime, conjuring up images of her laughing with someone else, her hand on another man's arm. I barely recognized myself anymore. I'd become jumpy, suspicious, pathetic. The guy the first used to be, the one who laughed easily, took things in stride, had been replaced by this jittery shell of a man obsessed with one thing. Was Ava cheating on me again? Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every night I'd lie there next to her, Ava's soft breathing doing nothing to calm the raging storm inside my head. I'd rerun conversations we'd had, searching for some hidden meaning I'd missed, some veiled reference to her secret life. It was like all the joy and spontaneity we'd once had was now tainted, poisoned by my own paranoia. Then, one gray morning when Ava was asleep, I caved. The temptation had been building for weeks. Her phone sat on the dresser, practically mocking me. It was like a box with some terrible secret inside. A secret I both desperately needed to know and was terrified of at the same time. With shaking hands, I picked up the phone. For a moment, I just held it, knowing this was the point of no return. Swiping the screen open felt like some monstrous breach of trust, but I did it. Messages flashed up on the screen, a mix of friendly chatter and cryptic text that made my stomach drop. I wanted to stop, put the phone down and pretend this never happened, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been sown, and there was no going back from this. My fingers moved as if on autopilot, scrolling through conversation after sickening conversation. With each message, it felt like a brick was being added to the wall I'd so desperately tried to build around my heart. Turns out, the wall was an illusion the whole time. There was no singular, gym guy, but a network of them. A string of flirtations, late-night meetups, and cleverly disguised excuses to get away from me. The reality of Ava's betrayal was worse than I ever dared imagine. The knowledge sat heavy inside me, like poison. Part of me wanted to throw the phone, scream, wake Ava up and demand answers. But another part, the cowardly part, took over. For a moment, the room tilted, and I saw stars on the edges of my vision as my knees nearly buckled. I tasted bile in the back of my throat and knew I needed to sit down, get grounded, before I physically reacted to this devastating revelation. Suddenly, Ava stirred, shifting beside me on the bed. I panicked, my hands trembling as I slid the phone under the pillow, my heart hammering against my ribs. The nausea threatened to overwhelm me, and for a moment, the room spun wildly around me. "You okay?" Ava's voice was thick with sleep. I could barely speak. All I could manage was a choked, "Yeah, fine. Just bad dream." The guilt washed over me like a tidal wave. How had I become this? Sneaking around, lying, violating the privacy of the very person I claimed to love. Yet, the most sickening realization was that, unlike Sarah, I couldn't even muster the strength to be angry. My own hypocrisy cut deeper than any betrayal could. I wasn't the cheated on husband demanding justice. I was simply the cheater, facing his own terrible reflection. Ava's muffled humming from the shower sounded like a drill aimed at my brain. I had to get out. Without a word, without even looking back at her, I grabbed my keys and left the apartment. The door clicked closed behind me, and I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. My only instinct was to escape. I ended up roaming the city, my phone on silent, mind racing. With each step, the realization sank deeper. I had become everything I despise. I saw my reflection in a store window and barely recognized the man staring back at me. Pale, unshaven, eyes hollowed by guilt and shame. This was what a serial cheater looked like. By late afternoon, my feet ached and my head was spinning. I found myself at a seedy dive bar, the kind of place I'd never stepped foot in before. It didn't matter. I just needed to drown the voices inside my head, the ones screaming accusations, taunting me with my endless failures. Each drink was a temporary reprieve. A shot of whiskey burned away the guilt and shame, offering a false numbness for a few minutes. Then the truth would crash back in, like waves against a crumbling cliff, each one eroding me further. I was alone, the architect of my own misery, and there was no escape from that brutal truth. The harsh sunlight of morning pierced through the blinds like knives. My head felt like it might split open, mirroring the chaos inside me. I stumbled to the phone and choked out some half-hearted lie about being sick to work. I had no idea how I would face anyone, let alone my coworkers. For all they knew, I was just some average guy dealing with a cold, not a walking disaster zone. Days melted into a haze. I barely ate, barely slept, and ignored the outside world entirely. The apartment became a tomb, with me as the ghost haunting it. Ava's unanswered texts and increasingly frantic voicemails piled up like another layer of guilt. The silence from Lily was even worse. It felt like the final confirmation of my utter failure. One afternoon, a sharp knock on the door made me jump. Terror shot through me. Was it Ava, come to confront me? Worse, Sarah? It took all my remaining strength to get up and answer. The sight of Sarah standing on the other side of the door hit me like a gut punch. My stomach clenched, she looked pale, her eyes swollen, but there was a steely determination in her stance. In her hand, she held a battered manila envelope. Papers, she said, her voice rough but firm, for my lawyer. It's time to make this official. Sarah's lawyer was a shark. Every demand was met. Every asset I'd worked my entire life for split down the middle. I wanted to fight, to claim my rights, but deep down, I knew I didn't deserve them. It was as if the fight had been beaten out of me. Sarah, the woman I'd once seen as timid and soft, transformed in my absence. She became a relentless force, protecting Lily like a lioness. I was no match for her, and maybe I shouldn't have been. Seeing Lily on those court-mandated visits was torture. Her bright eyes now held wariness, the sparkle slowly dimming. I tried to build sandcastles and play silly games to ease her confusion, but even my forced laughter sounded hollow. All I ever wanted was to be a good dad, and here I was, the villain who broke her life apart. Work became my safe haven, the only place where my past didn't immediately follow me. I buried myself in spreadsheets and reports, seeking the solace of numbers and monotony. Every promotion, every bit of praise from my boss, felt like a cruel joke. None of it mattered. I was just a hollow shell, a success on paper and a failure everywhere else. The loneliness became suffocating. Out of despair, I even tried those dumb dating apps. I'd sit through awkward dinners, feigning interest in hobbies I didn't share and dreams I'd shattered in my own life. None of it ever felt genuine. The fear of hurting someone again, of becoming the monster I now knew I was capable of, held me back from any real connection. Then one day, as I was scrolling through my phone mindlessly, a message from Ada popped up. "I miss you," it said. Anger flared momentarily, quickly followed by a crushing numbness. With a few taps of my thumb, I deleted it, the final echo of a chapter one desperately wanted to close. A year had gone by. My birthday, once a day of celebration, now echoed with silence. Gifts sent by well-meaning family remained unopened on the kitchen counter. The phone was quiet. When I dared to peek at Sarah's social media, the image that met my eyes burned itself into my mind. Her beaming smile, Lily laughing by her side, and a man with his arm casually around them both. It was the family portrait I'd tossed away for a cheap imitation. Lily's visits grew less frequent. Sarah, with good reason, wanted to shield her from further pain. My little girl, who used to brighten any room, became a shadow of her former self, her silence a mirror of my own. It was then I finally knew I needed help. The therapist's office was a stark, impersonal box. I sat across from a woman with kind eyes, a notebook in her hand. I began talking, and the words tumbled out in a messy cascade. The lies, the choices, the consequences. The road to healing, she promised, would be a long one. And so it began, the painful process of facing the wreckage I had created, one ugly truth at a time. My therapist's suggestion at first seemed ridiculous. A letter to Sarah, a written confession of my sins? It felt too easy, like tossing a few measly words onto a page would magically erase the pain I'd caused. Still, desperate for some form of release, I sat down and started to write. It was agonizing. Each word dredged up a memory, a fresh wave of regret threatening to pull me under. There were apologies for the big things, the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the smaller hurts, the broken promises, the careless words that chipped away at our foundation. When it was done, I sealed the envelope and sent it off, unsure if Sarah would even read it. To my surprise, there was no fiery reply, no angry phone call. It was as if the letter had disappeared into a void. At first, the silence was maddening, but gradually, a strange sort of calmness emerged. Maybe Sarah tossed it into the trash. Maybe it was still on her kitchen counter, unopened. It didn't matter. The act of laying myself bare, taking full ownership of my mistakes, it cracked something open inside me, a flicker of hope that maybe there was a path to healing. Years went by. I threw myself into work, but with a different purpose. I reconnected with old friends, found new hobbies, took care of my health. The loneliness never fully went away, but the edges softened. Then, a bolt out of the blue, Lily, now a teenager, reached out. Stiff, awkward messages at first, then tentatively scheduled visits. Conversations slowly shifted from stilted small talk to something resembling real connection. We laughed over inside jokes, shared photos and stories. The road ahead was still a minefield, filled with the damage I'd inflicted, but we were finally on it together. One morning, an unrecognizable number flashed on my phone. Dread twisted my insides. This felt like a summons, a day of final reckoning. Mister, the voice was unfamiliar and laced with worry. This is Sarah's mother. There's been an accident. She's in the hospital. The blood drained from my face. I rushed to the hospital, my mind a maelstrom of images. Sarah, the way she used to toss her head back when she laughed. The last time I saw her whole in the hospital waiting room became my prison. Sarah's mother and I united in anguish. When a grim-faced doctor finally emerged, it felt like the final scene of some dreadful play. Sarah's injuries were extensive, the prognosis grim. I sat by her bedside, taking her hand, a silent plea for forgiveness echoing in the sterile silence. Weeks turned into a blur. Lily, stoic and withdrawn, kept vigil. In the quiet moments, despair threatened to swallow me whole. Had I simply traded one destroyed life for another? Then one day, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open, confusion, then recognition. A flicker of emotion played across her face, anger, hurt, and maybe the tiniest spark of forgiveness. From that day on, our conversations were brief, measured, but there was a truce, an unspoken recognition of shared devastation. We focused on Lily, walking down the bustling streets of New York. I couldn't shake off this gnawing feeling of loneliness. 18 years of marriage to Mark, and here I was, feeling like something crucial was missing. It wasn't about love or companionship. Mark and I had plenty of that. It was about excitement, the thrill of something new, something entirely mine. The day I met Alex changed everything. I was at this local art gallery opening, a rare outing I allowed myself to indulge in. The gallery was packed, the air filled with the scent of wine and oil paint. And then there he was, Alex, standing beside the most vibrant painting I had ever seen. His passion for life, for art, was palpable. We got to talking, and I was drawn to him like a moth to a flame. There was this undeniable connection between us, a spark that I hadn't felt in years. Before I knew it, Alex and I were meeting for coffee regularly. I told myself it was harmless. After all, we were just two people enjoying each other's company, right? But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Each meeting with him was like a breath of fresh air, a break from my routine life. It was exhilarating. One night, he invited me to his studio to see his latest masterpiece. The studio was dimly lit, the atmosphere intimate. When he unveiled his painting, the beauty of it took my breath away. But it wasn't just the art that had my heart racing. It was Alex, standing so close, looking into my eyes. And then, in the soft glow of the studio lights, we kissed. It was passionate, intense, and completely unexpected. I was caught in the thrill of the moment, and before I knew it, I was spiraling into an affair with Alex. I became adept at hiding my tracks. Messages were deleted the moment they were read, and I became a master at crafting believable lies about where I was. I even bought Alex an expensive watch as a token of my affection, telling Mark it was a purchase for a work bonus. I knew I was walking on thin ice, but I couldn't stop myself. The excitement was too intoxicating. But then, Mark started to get suspicious. It was the little things at first, questioning my frequent absences and the mysterious expenses popping up on our bank statements. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the hurt. I brushed off his concerns with more lies, but each lie felt like a brick added to the wall between us. Mark's suspicions grew with each passing day, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The night Mark decided to follow me changed everything. He saw Alex and me outside that upscale restaurant, wrapped up in an embrace that left no room for doubt. I didn't know it then, but my world was about to come crashing down. The confrontation came the next day. Mark, with photos in hand that were like daggers to my heart, demanded the truth. The look in his eyes, a mix of pain and betrayal, was something I'll never forget. "How could you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but loaded with devastation. I broke down. The walls I had built crumbled under the weight of my guilt and fear. I was lost, I confessed, trying to explain the unexplainable. I talked about the lost youth, the craving for excitement, anything that might make him understand. But the more I spoke, the more I realized there was no justification for what I had done. Mark didn't say much after my confession. He simply left a note on our kitchen table the following morning, stating he couldn't forgive me and that he was moving out. That note was Mark's goodbye, and it ripped me open in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was left to face the consequences of my actions alone. With Mark gone, I turned to Alex, but things had shifted. His affection cooled, his presence became sporadic, and I soon found myself on the receiving end of the deceit I had once dished out. It didn't take long for me to uncover the truth. Alex was seeing someone else. The expensive watch I had given him, meant to be a token of our love, was now just a tool he used to charm his new interest. I confronted Alex, my emotions raw and unguarded. "How could you do this to me?" I demanded, seeking some semblance of the connection we once had. But his response was cold, a stark contrast to the warmth I once felt from him. "What did you expect?" he retorted, his words cutting deeper than any physical wound. The realization hit me hard. Alex's affection, his promises, they were all a facade. I was left grappling with the fact that I had risked everything for a love that was never real. The pain of Mark's departure, now compounded by Alex's betrayal, left me in a state of profound despair. The choices I had made, driven by a fleeting desire for excitement, had led me to lose the very foundation of my life. Mark's absence was a constant ache, a reminder of the love I had forsaken for a mirage. Right after everything with Alex fell apart, I knew I had to make things right with Mark. But when I tried to reach him, to say all the things I should have said before, I hit a wall. Mark had vanished, leaving no trace behind in the city we called home for nearly 2 decades. It was like he wanted to erase every memory that tied him to me, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. Dialing mutual friends led nowhere. "Sorry, I haven't heard from him," they'd say, or "Mark, he's gone off the grid." Their voices were tinged with a mix of pity and discomfort. Mark had changed his number, wiped his social media clean. It was a digital ghosting of epic proportions. Desperation drove me to visit his favorite spots around the city. The little jazz club he loved, the park where we'd walk on Sundays, even the coffee shop where he'd spend hours working on his laptop. Nothing. It was like chasing shadows, hoping for a glimpse of him but finding emptiness instead. Then, one day, I bumped into someone who used to nod at us in passing, a face without a name. Mark? Oh, he's left the country, they mentioned casually, as if talking about the weather. Started a new life somewhere without the baggage of the past, they added, unwittingly twisting the knife deeper into my already wounded heart. Alone, truly alone. I was left to pick up the pieces of the life I'd shattered. The excitement and passion I thought I found in Alex's arms had dissipated, leaving a bitter taste of ash in my mouth. Then, the final blow came, a thick envelope in the mail. Divorce papers. Mark's handwriting on a note tucked inside, wishing me happiness but clearly stating he could no longer be a part of my life. His words, so final, echoed in the hollows of my empty apartment. Signing those papers felt like signing away a part of my soul. I had gambled everything on a fleeting desire for something new and lost more than I ever imagined. The realization of what my quest for new love cost me was devastating. Mark's goodbye wasn't just to our marriage but to the life we built, the memories we shared. It was a wake-up call to the irreversible damage my actions had caused. In the aftermath, I tried to rebuild, to find some semblance of joy or purpose. But every attempt felt like a half-hearted effort to fill a void too vast to ever be filled. The silence of the apartment was a constant reminder of the love and companionship I'd forsaken. I was starting from scratch, but this time, I had to do it alone, haunted by the choices that led me here. Signing those divorce papers wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the closing of a chapter one could never revisit, a stark reminder of the cost of my actions. Trying to bury myself in work and social activities felt like slapping a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. No matter how much I tried to fill my days, the nights were relentless, echoing with the emptiness and regret of losing Mark. It was like I was living in a shadow, going through the motions but not really living. Then, at this crowded public event, I spotted Alex. There he was, laughing and looking carefree with someone new by his side. Our eyes met for a fleeting moment, but he quickly looked away, as if I was a stranger. That indifference, that deliberate snub, it stung more than I expected. Seeing him flaunt his new partner while I was still picking up the pieces of my life felt like a cruel joke. Around the same time, whispers reached me about Mark's new life abroad. They said he was doing well, that he was happy. Each rumor felt like a fresh reminder of what I had lost, deepening the chasm of loneliness and isolation within me. The decision to sell our home wasn't easy. That house was more than just a place to live. It was a repository of nearly 2 decades of memories, of dreams built and shared together. But clinging to it felt like clinging to a ghost, to a past that was no longer mine. Packing up those memories was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I found an old photo of Mark and me, smiling, so deeply in love. It felt like looking at two strangers, a stark reminder of everything that had changed. Tears came, unbidden, as I held the photo, mourning not just the loss of our marriage, but the loss of who we had been together. The day I left the house for the last time, it was eerily silent. The empty rooms echoed back my footsteps, a tangible representation of the void inside me. Standing there, in the doorway, I realized this was it, the final goodbye to the life I had known. In the months that followed, I tried to open myself up to new relationships, but it was like I was sabotaging myself before anything could even begin. Trust issues, guilt, the fear of making the same mistakes again. It all built an invisible barrier I couldn't seem to break through. That's when I decided to adopt a dog. I figured if I couldn't trust myself with people, at least I could try with an animal. The day I brought that little bundle of fur home was the first time in a long while that I felt a genuine spark of joy. It was different, of course, from the companionship of a partner, but it was a start. That dog became my shadow, offering a semblance of the unconditional love I so desperately craved, a silent witness to my attempts to rebuild from the ruins of my own making. Diving into volunteer work at a local charity, I found a way to escape the silence of my apartment, to drown out the noise in my head. It wasn't just about keeping busy, it was about trying to piece together a version of myself, one that could look in the mirror without flinching. Then, out of the blue, an invitation to a gallery opening landed in my mailbox. It felt like a sign, a nudge to reconnect with the part of me that got lost in the chaos of my personal life. I decided to go, clinging to the hope that being surrounded by art would spark that joy in me again. At the gallery, amid the swirl of colors and the murmur of voices, I thought I heard Mark's name. My heart skipped, thinking, for a brief, irrational moment, that he might be there. But it was just someone else sharing his name. That momentary jolt was a stark reminder of how deeply he's still etched in my thoughts. Seeking solace, I signed up for art classes. There's something about channeling your emotions into something tangible, something that doesn't judge or demand explanations. With each stroke of the brush, I felt a tiny bit of peace, as if I was slowly painting over the cracks in my heart. Running into Alex was inevitable, given our shared interests. But now, our interactions were nothing but a cold exchange of pleasantries, if that. The man I once thought I knew was now just another stranger with a familiar face. Seeing him didn't stir the old emotions. If anything, it just reinforced my decision to leave that part of my life behind. When I saw on social media that Alex was entangled in yet another relationship, I couldn't help but feel a mix of pity and disdain. It was a reminder of the bullet I dodged, despite the collateral damage I suffered in the process. The wedding invitation from a friend was another test. Going alone meant facing the reality of my situation head-on, surrounded by happy couples, a mirror to my own solitude. But I went, determined to not let my past dictate my present. At the wedding, the sea of couples was a stark contrast to my solo presence. It highlighted my solitude, but also my strength. I was navigating this world on my own terms, learning to be okay with being alone. It wasn't easy, but there was a certain pride in standing on my own, amidst the reminders of what I had lost and what I was yet to find. In a quiet corner of my now too familiar apartment, I began to write a journal. Each entry, a confession, a revelation, a step towards understanding the chaos I'd caused. Writing became my therapy, a way to untangle the mess of my thoughts and maybe, just maybe, learn something from the wreckage of my past. The urge to escape, to find a piece of myself I thought was lost, led me to make a bold decision. I was going to travel solo. Packing my bag felt like shedding old skin. Readying myself for whatever lessons lay in the unknown, I sought out new places and cultures, each destination a chapter in my ongoing journey of self-discovery. My travels introduced me to people with stories that echoed my own, tales of love lost and found, of redemption and forgiveness. These encounters, shared over cups of coffee or long walks, were reminders that I wasn't alone in my quest for meaning amidst the ruins of my choices. Returning home, I carried a new perspective within me, a mosaic of the experiences and insights I'd gathered. Yet, the shadow of my past decisions trailed me like a persistent fog, coloring my attempts to reconnect with the life I'd left behind. Old friends, once pillars of support, now stood distant, the bridges between us weakened by my actions. Driven by a newfound passion, I poured myself into organizing a solo art exhibit. My artwork, each piece a fragment of my emotional odyssey, was my attempt to communicate what words could not. The exhibit, modest in its attendance, became a milestone for me, a marker of progress on a path fraught with self-doubt and reflection. The adoption of another dog brought unexpected comfort. Their simple, unconditional love a balm for my restless spirit. It was in the quiet moments, watching them play or simply sitting together in silence, that I found a semblance of peace. Inspired by my journey, I started a blog, sharing my story, raw and unfiltered. I hoped to reach others navigating their own turbulent seas. The feedback was a mix of empathy, criticism, and gratitude. Each comment, each shared story, was a reminder of the power of vulnerability. One evening, as the city settled into its nocturnal rhythm, I found Mark's note again. Reading it with the distance of time and experience, I finally understood the depth of his pain, the magnitude of the loss we both suffered. It was a poignant realization, the acknowledgement of the true cost of my actions. Reflection brought clarity, albeit a painful one. My search for excitement, for something more, had led me away from the very happiness I had taken for granted. The lesson was a harsh one, learned in the aftermath of choices that couldn't be undone. With a heart heavy with regret, but driven by a desire to make amends, however small, I dedicated myself to helping others. My story, once a source of personal shame, became my tool. A cautionary tale about the consequences of chasing fleeting desires at the expense of what truly matters. Standing alone on a bridge as the dusk turned the city into a canvas of lights and shadows, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The journey from the person I was to who I had become was marked by loss, but also by growth. Mark's goodbye, though it once felt like the deepest of wounds, had become a catalyst for change, a painful but necessary push towards self-discovery. Looking out over the city, I understood that my quest for new love had cost me everything. And yet, in the solitude of that realization, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance